Many people in our society and world today would agree that they don't like being watched or spied on. So, why the need for surveillance? It's simple safety. Normal citizens would agree that people such as terrorists and murderers deserve and warrant surveillance. But what about the rest of us? Surveillance itself isn't the problem because it can be used for good. The problem is when people in authority abuse this power. Examples of surveillance, good and bad, are shown in the pieces of literature that we've read and in the real world today. One of the earliest examples of surveillance was during the Black Plague, as described by Michael Foucault's Discipline and Punish. During this tough time, people resorted to surveillance to stop the spread of the illness. The act of this surveillance included the closing off of houses, constant inspection and registration, and each night before everyone in the town went to bed, they had to be watched and checked in to make sure they were where they were supposed to be. Another example of surveillance in Foucault's writings was the Panopticon, created by Jeremy Bentham. This is the ultimate surveillance building, a tower in the middle of a prison where the people in the tower can see every prisoner, but the prisoners can't see them or anybody else. The idea of the Panopticon is total surveillance and to show complete power over the prisoners. Frederick Douglass gives us more insight to the surveillance of slaves during slavery. The earliest slaves were brought over from Africa, but as the slave culture grew, so did the population of slaves in the United States. There were babies that were literally born a slave and raised to be productive in their work. James C. Trotman, who wrote a biography on Frederick Douglass, explains, "Few born into American slavery knew anything about themselves, their ancestors, their African homes, or their parentage." The abuse of surveillance used in today's world is far different from times in slavery. Slave owners would use their surveillance as a method to dehumanize their slaves. The fact that some of these people didn't even know who they were is unbelievable. Even when the slaves did receive clothing or food, it wasn't very much. According to Frederick Douglass himself, he states, "Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter, made of coarse negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. Every aspect of these people's poor lives was being watched and watched very closely, to the point where these people didn't even feel like people anymore." Not only was surveillance used in the past, but it's most prevalent today, and to some people, an invasion of privacy. It all starts with the NSA, the National Security Agency, and 9/11. After 9/11, the United States was in a place of vulnerability and anxiety. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The Patriot Act, which was signed by George Bush on October 26, 2001, roughly a month and a half after 9/11, to provide appropriate tools to intercept terrorist attacks, expired on June 1st of this year. And Senate Republicans have introduced a bill that would allow continued collection of call records of nearly every American. The legislation would reauthorize sections of the Patriot Act, including the provision under which the NSA requires phone companies to turn over the to and from records of most domestic landline calls. To add to this, according to the New York Times, in 1978, the Foreign Surveillance Act was created. This act authorizes a form of wiretapping into the cell phones of millions of people without individualized warrants. This still continues today. When will it ever end? With all of these examples of surveillance, there's no doubt it can be used for good, and there's no doubt it can be a bad idea of supreme control and power. The question is, what's next?